can't tell you how much in the last 12 months I've heard this question brought to me, and I can't help them. Mr. Grandich, is there any way I can get my money offshore or get out of here or get it to where the government can't take it, et cetera, et cetera? From normal people, not gold bugs, not
Hmm.
people that own a lot of mining shares or anything, just
Right.
regular working people of older, because that's how concerned they are about the safety.
Is the world falling to pieces? Will gold and silver offer a safe harbor for investors who want to preserve their wealth? Today, we're fortunate to be joined by Mr. Peter Grandich. He has decades of experience following the general markets, the precious metals, and even the junior mining stocks. Peter, welcome to Ron's Basement.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Ron. Thank you.
So I have one question for you, Peter. What's going on in the world? The best word that I can come up with to describe how I feel when I look at just everything going on is scary and synthetic. Do you have any thoughts on what you see happening right now?
My one word would be evil. So, uh, and that's both from a secular view and a spiritual view. There's no question that we've had tough times in the past, but this is unique now, only because the way people can communicate and instantaneously things happen. And let me just give you an example of how something can get out of hand quickly. As we speak, as we talked just a few days ago, the Middle East crisis during the evening or night for us, suddenly there were reports that a hospital was hit by the Israelis. And immediately, I mean, faster than because of the internet and all sorts of reports and stories confirming the Israelis struck this hospital, hundreds are killed, and of course that set off more protests and more anger and more fodder for this horrific incident to begin with. And the reality was, when we came the next morning, by the combination of what was shown on actual video, understanding logics and experts explaining about rockets and what the difference of when a missile hits versus a rocket that went up and came down. And then we see it was basically the parking lot that was kind of destroyed, had nothing. The hospital was still standing, but the damage was already done.
Mhm.
And so I think the difference between now and any other, when people go, oh, the Middle East, there's been problems there in the past. No, for starters, there's a lot quicker ways to get things out of hand than used to be. And this involves a much deeper story, and it goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, Ron. There are people that just literally hate each other, that they could go in and kill innocent women, adults, and especially children without any disregard or emotional feeling. I can't begin to imagine even the most angry person I've ever been mad at in my entire life that I would go and slit their throat or something of that nature. And so that's the other ingredient that I think people have to understand. And if I may add just one, how spiritual ties into this. When you have people who believe their God or how they see God applauds them and rewards them for killing, when there's another side that actually believes that their savior came to save people from killing themselves and living, terrible eternal life, etc. That's hard to battle a group that believes that there's a God that's going to reward them for killing, and that's what we're up against.
Yeah. I was last night I was watching some TV appearances. You've been on most every major network over your years, and there were a couple clips from you in the 1980s, the late 1980s. If we could go back in time and visit that Peter Grandich in 1987, and we told you what was going on now in the world in general, but even on top of that, what's going on in the United States, do you think you would believe me?
Well, no. First of all, it's ironic that today, as we record on the 19th of October, it's an important date for me because it's where really I made my mark in the financial service business. I was only in the business a few years. I was head of investment strategy for a firm. And in that August of 1987, I put out a forecast of a stock market crash. People laughed. I mean, just not going to happen. October 19th, we fell 22, almost 23% alone that day. and there were dire predictions of what was going to happen for that. And the next day, I actually said that within 2 years we should be back at a new high. So a lot of comments were lucky calling the crash, nuts thinking we're going to be back to new highs. But what I would find astonishing most, first, how we moved away from what our parents and our grandparents believed and acted, both in society, socially, politically. But if you told me back then that we would have anything with a trillion, let alone 33 trillion in debt and multi-trillion dollar deficits. When I entered the business back in 1984, America was the largest creditor nation.
Yeah.
Now we're literally at the point where people are concerned we may not even be able to fund the interest expense on the debt that's getting out of hand. So that would be my single biggest unbelievable thought, that if you told me that you came from the future and that was happening, I would tell you, you're some crazy guy. But that is the ability to have turned this country so indebted. And Ron, people have to understand it's not just on the government level, it's personal debt and it's corporate debt as well that's gotten out of hand.
I know it's my background's in accounting, so I look at the numbers and it is truly astonishing. Like you said, student loan debt, mortgage debt, credit card debt, corporate debt, and then we hear more and more, especially in this higher interest rate environment, that there's a lot of companies, mid-size and larger companies in the United States that are zombie companies that were only able to exist because of the low interest rate environment. And that as we look out into the next year or two, that there could be a wave of bankruptcies coming there. I think one thing that always strikes me about debt, and you hear, I've heard the number 300 trillion in total debt throughout the whole world, is that somebody thinks they're going to get paid back on all that debt. And there's speculation that there's like no way possible that with all this synthetic debt in the world, that everybody could ever get paid back what they think they are owed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's not going to happen. Listen, we're never going to pay back the $33 trillion. We may be able to get to a point somehow through an austerity of a generation or more, which I
Yeah.
don't think anybody really is prepared for in America. We have such a split now, political. I think that's critical for people to understand that, because remember, it's the politicians that are going to have to get together and finally get their act together and put their house in order. And we have two parties now that not only do not want to be in the same room with each other, but have fractions within their own parties that don't want to be in the same rooms with each other. So it's very hard to imagine that anything could come together. And I think this is the real scary part of what we're discussing. There's one last semi-bipartisan group that exists in Washington. Everything else is totally partisan, and that's the Congressional Budget Office. And the Congressional Budget Office earlier this year issued a dire warning, which they thought was dire then, that in less than 10 years we were going to hit $50 trillion, the way deficit spending and everything was going. Now they're changing that to as little as 6 or 7 years, because we've gone insanely on a debt binge since the last so-called debt ceiling push off. Remember, that comes back in November. We never solved it. We still have to
Mm-hmm.
answer that and all. And when you start to think that in 6 or 7 years, that's basically, please God, for everybody listening to this, is still going to be alive. It's not like 10 or 20 years ago when we used to talk what we knew was 10, 20, 30 years away. We didn't get too worried about it, but it's all within our reach now. And I can tell you this, in our planning group that we still sit with, and with all sorts of different people at all sorts of different income levels and things of that nature, age, 7 out of 10 Americans continue to live beyond their life. Their lifestyle is bigger than their finances, and they still borrow from the future by incurring debt now, or instead of preparing for the future and putting money towards retirement and all, they use it to live today. And people are not even remotely ready for what could happen. And then those that are living beyond their lifestyle run, many of them are still betting that markets are going to be performing in the same way they last a couple of decades ago. And they don't understand how much has changed monetarily, politically, and all that. We just can't see that rampant flooded money where the Fed just goes and prints all sorts of funny money again, and stock markets go through the roof and bonds go back to 1% and all. That's not in the cards. And those people are really in for a rude awakening.
Yeah, the hens may be coming home to roost, are the grand finale. I don't. It's hard to put into words, but I'm 53 years old, and I just look at the last 20 or so years, and it feels like it was a big party. And most people I know, yeah, they just kind of think, well, I put money in my 401k, and it just goes up and up and up, and it's like magic, and it just doesn't last forever. The one thing I want to interject with what you were saying that it came to mind is the other thing that really gets me is with the deficit. We're spending $1.4 trillion every year more than we bring in as a country. And even with that, like spending that much more money, all they can squeeze out of our economy is whatever it is, 2% growth. I mean, wouldn't you think that it just feels like everything is coming to a head? And I don't want to be negative and I don't want to be doom and gloom, but I want to be a realist as well. And it feels like we're at a major tipping point, whether looking at it on a big macro worldwide level or just the United States, or even the way a lot of our friends and neighbors here, our fellow citizens in the United States are living their life. It's like we're on thin ice. Is a is,
Well,
is
well, well, Ron, as an accountant, if you were talking to me in my business and you were looking at my books, you would say, "Hey, Pete, you owe some workers some money. You have some, you have to put money aside. You have to fund
yeah,
unfunded liabilities. It's required." Okay, government doesn't. That's why that and the fact that and one of the other negatives that's coming home to roost, it got away with a lot of this because it was the world reserve currency. And Ron, there's no question, I think bull or bear could argue that much of the world is moving away from America, or at least not looking at it in the same manner that it did 10, 20, or 30 years ago.
yeah,
And we've already seen a decline in the usage of the dollar over the last 10 or 20 years significantly. We're seeing a lot of people, including our adversaries that once held a lot of our debt, selling it. And we see the BRICS, whether you like it or not, or you're not going to turn on NBC and see it reporting on it. But the fact is, that's a growing group. That's a movement that's moving forward, not backwards like America. And
yeah.
all those things are negatives for the United States. And I have to tell you this, Ron, it doesn't help my planning group. I don't sell any type of physical bullion or anything like that. I don't sell dry food, ammo, guns, cabins in the woods. This talk doesn't bring more people because what happens, Ron, just so you know, they hear it, and I hear this line, well, I know you're right, but I'm praying you're wrong, Miss Grandich. And then they go down to the street to the guy that's a member of the Don't Worry Be Happy crowd and says, that guy Grandich is a nut job. Listen, let me tell you why everything's going to be hunky dory. That's easier to accept because people don't, human beings don't like change in any regard, in anything. Okay.
Right.
And to ask them now to recognize that they have to make such a volatile change to versus how things have been, that's why it's also hard for the older people, your age up to my age in the 60s and 70s, to look at America and go, boy, everybody's screwed up. Look at these young people because they have moved completely away from the lifestyle and beliefs and everything that our parents and grandparents incorporated.
If you're looking to buy gold, silver, or platinum, do yourself a favor and check out Pimbex, the online precious metals bullion dealer and sponsor of Ron's Basement. I was a happy customer before they offered to support the channel. You'll find they have the best prices, quality, and service. I think Pimbex is best, and you will too. And be sure to tell them that you're from Ron's Basement.
The multicultural, relativism, wokeness is a fabric now in our society that didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. So for a young person, that's all they know. But for older people who saw a completely different lifestyle, go, oh man, this is going down the toilet. I can't tell you how much in the last 12 months I've heard this question brought to me, and I can't help them. Mr. Grandich, is there any way I can get my money offshore or get out of here or get it to where the government can't take it, et cetera, et cetera? From normal people, not gold bugs, not
Mm-hmm.
people that own a lot of mining shares or anything, just
Right.
regular working people. of older because that's how concerned they are about the safety. And that's why I talk about one thing, and I'm hopping all over. I'm sorry, Ron, but the thing that isn't spoken about in the investment world, which is critical, is, and I post from time to time on Twitter about it, that crime is a growth industry in America. One of the things that's underpinning concerns to people is the criminality that's happening. We're watching people just go into other people's businesses and stores and take what they want, laugh at it, and in some states like California, they want to punish the people if you interject and try to stop them.
Yeah.
Now that's gotten to the insanity when you talk about how crazy the world
Yeah.
is and all and all. And I don't just see how that reverses and we go back to happy days are here again. I just don't see how it could be possible, Ron.
No, it's not a pleasant situation. This morning I have twin 11-year-old daughters, and I look at the future for them and I'm concerned, right? Well, I was waiting for them to get on their school bus to go to school, and I sit on our front porch and I was going through preparing for my interview with Peter Grandich, and my neighbor Peter came walking by with his dog, and I said hi to him, and I know him pretty well on a pretty decent casual level. And I told him I was talking to you later, and he asked what my channel was about, and he echoed everything that you just said. And I would say, he's an aeronautical engineer. He's not a guy who's a gold bug or a silver bug or a mining stock investor, like you just said. He was like, we don't know what to do. He's referring to him and his wife. He's like, it's scary with everything. It feels like uh, not enough, but more and more people in the United States are maybe starting to wake up a little bit that we are not in a very good situation right now.
And again, and people always assume when I speak and talk negative about Democrats and the left, oh, he must be a Trumpster. I'm not really a Trumpster. The wife is. I'm not. I've
Right.
always felt he's been too arrogant. But if you look at it and take away personalities for a moment, realistically, the era that seemed to be the best that we can remember is when he was president.
Mm-hmm.
We had no energy crisis. We became energy self-efficient. He was making peace in the Middle East. No one gives credit, but and
Yeah.
we were getting close with Saudi Arabia. We had no problem to the extent that people have no idea what this border crisis is going to lead to when you start having. Listen, let me touch on this because this is not spoken a lot about, and it should be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't blame the people that are trying to come through that border, just so you know. If I was in a country where I know where they're coming from, things are not good compared to what they could live like here, even on our lower levels. And then I see that I can just get through. If I get there, I'm in. Uh, you're not going to not only not stop them, you're just going to encourage more and more of this. And
Mm-hmm.
it's asinine to try to understand how the group, the Biden, who's ever really supporting him, because he's deteriorating so bad right now, Ron, and so much that you're seeing it. I don't think he can go physically another 6 months. I don't think he can be propped up. He's having such terrible times, even in this trip to Israel, muttering and just all over the place. And this is the scariest thought. This is my scariest moment when you started. There's two words that if you had to say to me, I say it's all done, Ron. If you think it's bad now, it's going to get 10 times worse because of these two words. President Harris. If
Yeah.
Biden can't fulfill his presidency here, because I think in the end they'll announce that he's not going to run, for it.
Mm-hmm.
But if he can't fulfill the presidency and that person takes has to take over as president,
Yeah. Not good. Yeah. Can you imagine? I was just, as you were speaking, thinking about this. Over the last 3 years, we have a war in Europe, a real war in Europe. We have a real war in the Middle East. We have a border crisis, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot from the list. I'm just thinking, like, what's the cherry on top here? Will it be war with China? I mean, as I go back to 1987, I was 17 years old. You were on all the major news networks. And I asked you this earlier. I told you about, what was going on in the world. Do you think you would have thought that at that time, if you knew how the world was going to progress in the next 35 years or so, that you would want to hold silver and gold?
yeah, to some extent, but I still as much as people think, because I've been so incredibly bearish these last few years. But like you said, if you watch my old interviews, there was times I was very bullish on the markets, especially on the income side, because I felt interest rates were going to fall dramatically, and that was the safer bet. But I'll tell you the difference back then. So when I entered the business in 1984, and this is a good story. Let me take the time to tell you this, Ron.
Hmm.
This is very,
Yeah.
very good. So we had gone through 27 years where the Dow traded just between 700 and 1,000. And by 1980, the Business Week ran a famous magazine front cover that said equities are dead. And at that time, uh, Reagan was just coming in. He was going to blow up the world. That was going to be the thing. We had this, with the Soviet Union going on. Japan, not China, was going to be the
Yeah.
powerhouse.
Right.
China was just this little group that sold these little trinkets that you can buy real cheap. They were not considered anything close to what they are now. And basically, gold had just hit 800, and there were uh, there were things called Howard Ruff had the thing called the War Room where it was all day talking about gold and hide your money and all this kind of stuff. And equities, people like who would want to own stocks? Interest rates. I came in the brokerage business in March of 1984. And the first thing they gave me to sell by the phone, because that was the only way you could develop business. There was no internet, there were no cell phones. You dialed and told people we had 10-year, 15% CDs. And most people who didn't hang up said 15%. Interest rates were just 20. You can get me 17 or 18, I'd be interested. Now imagine that 15, what
Yeah.
we would do for 15% CD right now. Anyway, this guy comes out called Robert Prechter Jr. with the Elliott wave theory. And he projects, and they start to put him on, at the time was Financial News Network, there was no CNBC, and news stories of 2,700 on the Dow. Now, no, I'm sorry, 3,700 on the Dow. And people said, "Are you crazy? 3,700 on the Dow?" And he was laughed at, scoffed at by some people. But he had this thing called the Elliott wave theory. It was a technical analysis, which wasn't big on Wall Street at the time. And he started to get some coverage, and the market went up. And then when it got to its high in September of 87, he made a statement that sounded like he was calling for a crash. People argue whether it was or not. And I had already, as this young 31-year-old stockbroker that was put in this position of being the investment strategist for a New York Stock Exchange member firm, had about 200 and something brokers at the time. I forecast this crash, and they wanted me to retract it or resign. And can I tell you the reason why? Because this is very important for people to
Hmm.
understand why I have such a distaste for what I call the don't worry, be happy crowd on Wall Street. The chairman called me up and he said, "Listen, Peter, 90% of our clients are not going to sell everything which you're telling them. And if you're wrong, which we think you're going to be the laughing stock. They'll never listen to you again. But we can't afford that. And if you happen to be right, and this terrible thing that you're predicting happens, they're not going to be in any shape or mind to take advantage of when you tell them it's to go in. So let's look at the 10% that may listen to you. I'm willing to bet that half of them won't go in when you tell them it's time to go in. Peter, you can't stay on business in Wall Street with only 5% of the people truly profiting from your advice. So retract it or resign." I didn't. 10 days later, the Dow was up like another 7%. I was getting calls from our other brokers. "Hey, I passed by. They're hiring at the supermarket." I mean, things went on. Then the market started to turn in September, and then, of course, we had the crash. And the ironic thing about that whole thing was we were one of the only firms that were taking calls on the 19th and trades, and they went out of business because they took trades instead of just like a lot of the people didn't answer their phones. And the reason I say that all is the mentality then in the early 1980s was 360 degrees from where we were about 18 months ago in the market. Here, everybody still, even a lot, say market's the only place. It's going to go on, forever. It can't miss. Blah 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 blah. And we've turned 180 degrees, and we've
Yeah.
turned at a time when all the things that we just started discussing, that we could spend hours talking about the negative fundamentals that are out there and all. And yet, by and large, the financial community which can't read a balance sheet. You know, as an accountant,
Mhm.
you can go to most financial accountants, most financial advisors don't understand a balance sheet, couldn't read it, have no idea to understand how funding works and what brick nations and all that kind of stuff. And those are what most people are depending on, who don't really have an understanding. Even if they did, and I'll close with this. I rambled on. I'm sorry, but you got me going on a special day. I believe if the archangel Gabriel showed up at most chief market strategists or the talking heads you see on Tao TV, CNBC, and all, and told them directly, God sent me to tell you there's a crash coming, even if they believed the archangel and went down to their office to want to broadcast it, the firm will never let them broadcast it. So I don't believe there's true objectivity from most of the financial service industry. And that's why I feel that most people are still in this position and don't understand the ramifications of what's truly happening in the world today.
I agree with you 100%. I think most of my contemporaries uh, absolutely think that almost like there's no risk in the stock market. Like, oh, you just put money in, and if it goes down, I hear this all the time, it always comes back. It always comes back up. And I also agree with you 200% that I would bet 98% of the people out there, when they buy a stock, they don't know how the market works, number one, even just how to buy with limit orders or market orders. But most of them have no idea what they're buying. They'll buy Apple stock, for instance, because, well, I like Apple phones. They have no idea what, when they buy a share of Apple stock or any other stock, what they're actually doing and what they're getting for their money.
First Mining Gold is a development company advancing two of the largest gold projects in Canada, Springpole in Ontario and Duparquet located in Quebec. Each already has 5 million ounces of gold reserves, but exploration initiatives are underway at both projects to find even more gold. First Mining is well financed, has zero debt, and owns an interest in 4 additional Canadian gold development projects.
And I wanted to ask you, because that's something on my list here quickly, this magnificent seven that we have now, right? That makes up, what is it, 30% of the S&P 500, Facebook, Apple, Amazon. To me, that kind of just fits in with what you were just talking about, where people just don't believe that there's really any risk that they could lose money in these stocks, that they're just always going to go up, up, up forever.
Well, let me tell you something I think is very important, and I share this in all our meetings when people are willing to sit and listen, because a lot of people don't want to take the time. They want just things like this. The stock market is nothing, zero, almost zero, to what it was when I entered the business. When I entered the business in 1985, 90% of the trading was individual retail investors. That was it. And those people were buying and selling part ownerships of businesses. That's what they were buying it for.
Mm-hmm.
And we had 3 to 5 year outlooks. People were willing to wait that long for it. Today, over half the money that's all in the stock market is in what we call non-active funds, meaning they're tracing that they put money in these funds or with people who are trying to match indexes or indices and not actively trade. Just if they go up, keep my money in. If they go down, sell it out. And then the remaining half, about 80 to 90% of that is being driven by some sort of computer program. It may be simple algorithms that if there's a news story and these words are in it, you buy or short, or very complex strategies now with Gamma being short of this option, simultaneously selling this future and all. Those people have no idea, don't even care what the names of the companies are. They won't even tell you what they do or even know the name of the CEO. It's a very
Yeah.
sophisticated casino like atmosphere. So that's what makes up most of the markets. Okay, that's
Mm-hmm.
what's the money that's in there for this. And it's setting us up for not what people steal individuals like you talked about that have a 401k and think, well, people are looking at, and if the company's good, my guy is a money manager is going to buy it and sell it. Well, guess what? Nobel laureates have done very multiple studies and found that 80% of money managers underperform an index fund,
Yeah.
and 85% of bond managers underperform a fund. Now, think about that. if you and I were facing a medical or a legal problem, and we were told that the person or persons we're about to go to 8 out of 10 times don't perform as good as the other people over there, we're going to try to go to the other people over there. But yet, that's what makes up the so-called professional community right now. So I just think I hate to call it a disaster, but it's very dangerous. And
Hmm.
again, most people, remember now, 2/3 of our Americans are working paycheck to paycheck, Ron.
Hmm.
Retirement is not even an issue for them anymore. In fact, I put out a couple of days ago, and I was shocked that it was CNBC that first reported it. Studies have come out now that those people are more concerned about having enough to pay for a disaster of a $500 or $1,000 and have that so they can cover or buy food than they're even concerned about the retirement anymore, because they realize they're never going to be able to save enough money to retire and live those financial commercials you all see where you come and see them and they show you doing golf or whatever it is for the rest of your life and so forth and so on. It's a very it's so bad, it's unrealistic to think what I thought in 87 on this day and what was going to happen after that and what we're now facing now has no rhyme or reason. Like you said earlier, if you came and told me all this, I would have said this is just some crazy guy that smokes some very bad stuff.
And then I would have told you you'd be broadcasting to the world with some guy in his basement, right? We definitely would not have believed that, right?
Well, yeah, to think about then, I still remember the famous movie, that came out shortly after the crash. Some people have seen it, the original Wall Street movie with Michael Douglas, when he's walking with this big cell phone. They were this big, and only the rich had at the time on the beach. It's a famous scene in that movie. To think now that we can just take a little phone, not only take pictures and all, but communicate with each other,
Yeah,
post things and all.
yeah,
Technology wise, we've moved forward in some instances, but it's
yeah.
also opened the door for a lot of bad things to happen.
Yeah, I was going to say that there have been a lot of bad things, but technology, I was trying to think of some technology and the ability that even you and I, like right now, can connect and do this. And like I said, I mean, we are literally talking to the world. And I think that's maybe one of the few shining stars. But like you said as well, to a certain degree, that's been used for negative purposes also. As you were talking about how the markets are working now and how people don't know who the CEOs of the company are, or obviously, what the balance sheet of the company, they're just trading names. And it almost feels like, to a certain degree, and I've said this before myself, that to a certain degree it's almost become like a Ponzi scheme to a certain degree, because you're just relying on somebody in the future being willing to buy from you at a higher price, and that it sets it up for a potential crash at some point.
It's funny. I understand what you're saying, but it still comes down to some of us, at least, are still buying part ownerships in businesses. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the whole thinking behind it, that they would produce more gadgets or services and make it
Hmm.
more valuable. Somebody would want to come along and pay you more for it, and that person thinks they're going to do even better. And that was the philosophy of buying individual stocks. But where I think the Ponzi is even more is in the bond market, because it's all phony money. It much of the Federal Reserve has been the single biggest buyer of the
Yeah.
debt that they create out of thin air. And there's nothing backing that. Oh, yeah, it says on the back of your paper, the full faith and credit of the United States. Well, ex Donald Trump back in the 80s, when suddenly the banks didn't have any faith in him, could he get any credit? No. The same is happening in America, just slower
Yeah.
and more difficult. And that's why the bond market, which, if you think about it, that's another thing. If you would have said to me back in 87, hey, Pete, there'd be 3 years in a row where the bond market is down. You went to the bond market for safety back then, because that didn't happen. You
Hmm.
made less, but at least you had some income, and people could live a lifestyle off of that or retire off of knowing they're going to get X amount of dollars and all. But where you're really concerned now, and that's one of the things where the hiccup is in the bond market now, is some of the sharpest minds are finally talking, even on the tout TVs of the world, about, hey, listen, it's getting so out of hand of the debt. interest rates may stay relatively high, even if we do have an economic slowdown, because we have so much debt and it's going to be hard to keep financing it. That's
Mhm.
what's entering the picture now. It's not yet in the average individual person or financial advisor's mind because they're persons, they don't have to answer to people yet about that. But if we continue this way, they'll have to. And we're having less and less people ability to finance it. We've already seen what happens to a country that has to do it all themselves. Just look at Japan.
Mhm.
Japan is basically their only financier, and they have a demographic worse than us. They expect to have only two people working for every person retired within 10 years. That's unbelievable. That can't be sustainable. So
Yeah.
again, these are all issues that uh, are compounded and get a lot worse when you turn on the TV and you see what's happening in the Middle East now. When some group could hate another group so badly, and they might have done things that they feel that they deserve some retribution to it all. I'm not saying anybody's totally innocent, but to go and just murder and torture uh,
Yeah.
and think that your God or your who you believe is the reason you're here on earth encourage you and is going to reward you for that. That's a battle that I don't think America is prepared for yet. Israel, because of how they have been, in a sense, this little place surrounded by a lot of people that don't like them, have kind of built a rapport. But even there in that country, there's been a split of late on thinking how they should act as a country and all. So it's a very it
Yeah.
is the most peculiar and you used the right word, scary time since I've been alive, all 67 years.
Yeah. And I appreciate everything you've shared with us today, Peter. I want to interject too. You talked about the bond market being um, even maybe more of a not quote unquote, but a Ponzi type situation. Is the bond market's, like I've read recently, 3 times the size of the stock market as well? I mean, that makes it even scarier. And you know what you said, it's hard to put into words, but I try to explain like the whole system, whether you're talking about the bond market, the stock market, things have been so manipulated and have grown so out of whack that it feels like to me that the system's becoming very sensitive and very fragile. And the bigger it gets, and the more contorted things get, that it's that these big events are occurring on a more regular basis, that it's just, I guess I'll just say it's a scary time right now.
Ron, here's the
Yes.
scariest one. This is the one that I hope never comes true. Right now, because of the trillions of dollars, maybe 10 trillion or more, a third of all our debt, may even be up to a half now, has been floated in the last few years. Banks, our banking system lives on taking in your deposit and investing in it in a lot of places, including bonds or lending out money to people and so forth and so on. And virtually most banks now have substantial paper losses.
Mm-hmm.
If they had to liquidate their assets, they're at a loss. That's what caused the banking crisis several months ago. Now, right now, there's no reason or not apparent reason to expect a run on the banking system. But if that started to occur now, we'd have a huge, huge problem. Because even though you'd say, oh, this is what the don't be happy crowd, the Fed will come in, they'll add massive liquidity, rates will drop down. No, not anymore, because people are growing concern of our
Yeah.
ability to pay it back. That didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's the difference now. That's the real scary part. And that's the argument for the people who each day are out selling gold and the bullion dealers and all. That's their best argument. And a real argument now that might have been just a bad dream 10 or 20 years ago, but it's reality staring us in the face now.
Yeah. They can only keep the balls in the air for so long. Peter, thank you. It's been great talking to you. You have a wealth of knowledge, and even though these subjects maybe aren't necessarily pleasant to talk about, I know that my viewers prefer to hear the truth. And none of us claim to have a crystal ball. But when we look out there, we want to be prepared. And so thank you very much for your time. If people want to learn more about you, they go to petergrandich.com. Is that the best way?
That's our website. If they're on Twitter, I'm at Peter Grandich. That's where I found uh, the bulk of my communicating at this point. It's a lot of fun. It's easy. It's instantaneous. I do some interviews, and of course, I'm blessed when people like you decide that they want to talk to me. I post that on a YouTube channel that I have.
Well, you are one of my favorite guests to have here in Ron's basement. You know that, and next time we'll promise to everybody we'll even talk about the gold and silver mining stocks as well.
Well, I'm glad you kept them out because it was a great conversation without those mining shares.
Right? You never know. Next time they may be way up, so we'll have a lot more to talk about. Right?
That'll be great, Ron. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thanks, Peter.